Week 17 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few defense DST units I looked at off the wire this week. The first one, the Jacksonville Jaguars. So the Jaguars is a streaming option, is a good option this week. Available right now in 59% of fantasy leagues. Early in the season, they were amongst the league leaders in turnovers, but the last 5 weeks of the season, this defense has unraveled. So the last few weeks, week 14 at Cleveland, 31 points allowed, a sack, an interception, 2 fumble recoveries. Week 15 versus Baltimore, 23 points allowed, 3 sacks and INT. In week 16 at Tampa Bay, 30 points allowed and 2 sacks. So this week, I think Jacksonville in a great matchup versus the Panthers. They give up the third most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. Could be a good streaming option. They could get pressure on Bryce Young. And we know Bryce Young's good for a turnover or 2 per game as well. And for the most part, this Panther team hasn't really put up points on the board besides last week versus the Packers. So this week, Jacksonville, they're definitely a good streaming option. DST, I looked at off the wires, the Los Angeles Rams, and they're a good streaming option as well, available in 81% of fantasy leagues. At the New York Giants, I give up the second most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So the last few weeks for this Ram DST, week 14 at Baltimore, not a good game. 37 points allowed, 2 sacks and INT, a safety. Week 15 versus the Commanders, 20 points allowed, a sack, an interception, a block kick. And week 16 versus the Saints, 22 points allowed, 2 sacks, and an INT. So this week here, I think they could get pressure early and often. We know this Giant offense, for the most part, this year has had a lot of trouble scoring the football. But I know they do got good playmakers in Saquon Barkley, Darren Waller, and a deep ball threat in Jalen Hyatt, even though this season he really hasn't shown much in his rookie year. But anyway, I think this Ram DST could get pressure. They're still trying to keep their playoff hopes alive. And we know this Giant offense has given up a lot of points to DSTs all season, so they're definitely an option off the wire this week. Next, adds the Seattle Seahawks. So the Seahawks as another streaming option this week as well, I think could go out there and help fantasy owners. And right now, they're available, Seattle, still in tons of fantasy leagues here at 76%. So the last few weeks for Seattle, I know the numbers really haven't been there. Week 14 at the Niners, 28 points allowed, 3 sacks and interception, a fumble recovery. Week 15 versus Philly, 17 points allowed, 2 interceptions. And week 16 at Tennessee, in a good matchup on paper, 17 points allowed, but they did have the 6 sacks in that game. So right now, once again, a great matchup here versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. I know the Steelers offense, they emerged and had a breakout game versus the Bengals in the week 16 victory, but I think they could get pressure on Mason Rudolph, or if Kenny Pickett comes back in this game. We know they got ball hawks on this defense as well. And this Seattle team, their playoff hopes are alive, winning the last 2 weeks. So this week versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, create some havoc, make some plays, especially with the 12th man behind them. And they have a DST I would pick up off the wire this week. DST is the Houston Texans. So the Houston Texans this week, a great matchup for them versus the Tennessee Titans. 10th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So the last few weeks here for this Texan DST. Week 14 at the Jets, 30 points allowed, 4 sacks, a fumble recovery. Week 15 at Tennessee, 10 points allowed, 7 sacks, and INT. And week 16 versus Cleveland, they got torched in that one, 36 points allowed, a sack, 2 interceptions, but a return touchdown by Damian Pierce in that one, where they were actually serviceable last week. But this week, a good matchup versus Tennessee. We don't know if it's going to be Ryan Tannehill or Will Levis who's nursing that ankle injury. But right now, I think this defense, they could go out there and make some plays. And they need this ball game where their playoff hopes are slim right now, is this Houston Texan team with 2 more weeks left in the season. So right now, they could get pressure on Tannehill or Levis, whoever the quarterback is going to be. We know the Titans, one of the worst offensive lines in the league, and their offense as well is good for a turnover too. So I think Houston right now, while they're available in 61% of fantasy leagues, is a good DST to add off the wire this week. In the 5th and final DST I looked at off the wire this week here is the Indianapolis Colts. So the Colts right now available in 51% of fantasy leagues is their DST. And I know they give up a lot of points, but they're also a DST that scored a lot of points this season with pick sixes and just creating turnovers. So the last few weeks for this defense, week 14 at Cincinnati, 34 points allowed, an interception on a pick 6 touchdown. Week 15 versus Pittsburgh, 13 points allowed, 4 sacks, 2 INTs, a fumble recovery. 16 in Atlanta, they didn't do anything in that one. 29 points allowed and a sack, but week 17, a good matchup versus the Raiders. 9th most fantasy points they give up to DST. But we know this Raiders offense exploded a few weeks ago for 63 points. I don't see that happening once again versus Indianapolis, but I see it being a type of game where the Raiders put up mid-20s, low 30s in this one. But this defense does go out there and make a few plays and possibly could find an end zone. And that's what they've been doing, is this Indianapolis defense. They give up points, but they also go out there, create turnovers, and they found the end zone on special teams or on defense can play. So that's a few defense DST units I look to add here in week 17 of the fantasy football season.